use both screens to work. Right, so hopefully you now can see my screen. Is that correct? Excellent.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. And I've started the recording. So I want to talk about ethical questions. What are these? And there are two types of research ethics you can think in the context of the wider context of research. Ethics, which is around to the research being conducted in general, and then ethical questions which are directly related to the research project. And as a rule of thumb, I was trying to kind of think about where and what are the principles around thinking about ethics in different projects. And I think, as a rule of thumb, the key question you need to ask yourselves is, will my research have some impact on my participants? And it could have a number of types of impacts. So for example, you might be conducting interviews in a relatively sensitive setting, or asking sensitive questions. And those questions, they might bring memories, or they might bring thoughts to your participants which might make them feel uncomfortable. So that automatically raises ethical implications. There might be cases where the information you're collecting from your participants about their decisions, their lives, their work experience, might also have implications about the way their manager perceives them, and how do you store that information, and how do you communicate that information, how do you anonymize the information. So all these are questions which are related to ethics. And the other thing which you also need to consider, and a lot of you're doing qualitative type of analysis, is that in social sciences, there is almost no way that we as researchers, our thoughts, ideas, beliefs can be completely isolated from the research we're conducting. The way you interact as interviewer with your participants will be based on your assumptions about reality. It's not a lab. We're not experimenting in a lab where we can basically completely isolate our own kind of interaction with the project. So in terms of ethics, I think the fundamental question you need to think about is how far you, as a researcher, you're influencing the process of research, and how far can you document that in order to make it transparent to everyone else. It's not that you should be excluding yourself or you should be excluding your own ideas, but it's almost like you need to be transparent about how far you might have as a researcher kind of interacted with that. Obviously, in terms of the academic world, there is also a number of different pressures that we face as organizations and as researchers. And I've got this kind of fraud triangle here, which shows what are the three pressures that we're facing. Obviously, the first one is the motivation. You know, the publish or perish, let me put it this way. Academics are all around publications. The committees over the last few years, promotion committees and appointment committees, they tend to put a lot of emphasis on publication. So there is this motivation to generate research as quickly as possible, and to basically, you know, sometimes even self-plagiarize and put publications out there which are very, very similar to each other. On the other hand, you've got these two sides of the triangle, which is around the rationalization. So it's almost like we're trying to make the data fit our explanation that we have, which is, as I said, about ourselves and the bias, our own bias that we have. So it's like my theory reasoning is sound, the data is wrong and skewed. And at the moment, there is a very big kind of movement in that area where it asks researchers to almost register their expectations before you conduct any empirical type of analysis. So, you say, I'm going to be doing a study on that. This is what my theory says. These are my assumptions. And what you then do is you go and do the experiment, and you try to look at what the experiment tells you about your theory. And in that area is like what we call harking. I don't know whether anybody of you have come across the term, which is hypothesis after getting your results. So you basically do your empirical analysis, and then you try to develop your hypothesis around that, which is very close to moving to the other side of that triangle, the kind of opportunistic aspect, where researchers feel I can control the data and I can easily change them. It's not about ensuring that your data is robust and correct. It's not about simply checking whether you've got outliers, but it's also occasionally, changing the data or changing the results that your data can give you. And obviously there is a fine balance there between what I would call torturing the data to tell you the truth. So trying to work your data as hard as can in order to get the results that you are expecting, and then actually, changing the data or manipulating the data in a way that's basically changes the fundamental principle of collecting samples and everything like that. So these are the three pressures around research, and these are the pressures that create this fraud triangle, which has been it's very interesting. We haven't seen, there is a lot of at the moment, a lot of movement around retracting papers. You might have heard about, publicists trying to have more transparent processes for peer review. They ask you to deposit your data set in order to be able for other researchers to reproduce. They ask you to deposit your code if you're using a particular software. So the peer review process becomes more open and more transparent in terms of your results. And these kind of the fraud triangle leads to what we call questionable research practice. And I've got there, for most of the things I'm saying, the reference. So if you want to go and look at those references and read a bit more in your bedtime reading, that's absolutely fine. So there are cases of outright research fraud which make high headlines. There are, a lot of papers out there. There is this very interesting study which is currently feeding into the anti-vax movement, where back in 2000 there was a study with a very, very small sample claiming that vaccination could cause autism in people, and that gave rise to a big anti-vax movement with significant implications. We're seeing again diseases that we thought we had eradicated, at least in the developed world, and we're seeing them again emerging because people are not vaccinated. And there was this 2012 study by Lowenstein and Prelek that found that there are a lot of questionable research practices which are common against researchers. Selectivity in terms of the reporting of results, excluding data that affects results, and reporting unexpected findings as if they were expected, which is the harking. And so I think in your mini projects that you're doing over the summer, these are key things that you need to take into consideration in terms of your data collection, in terms of your data analysis. And you should always be honest in terms of, this is what my data is telling me, this is what I'm getting from my participants. You shouldn't be trying to change it to either please the supervisor or please whoever is the audience for your research. Now, is there a framework that governs research integrity? Yes, there is this Universities UK Concordat to support research integrity, which was created in 2012, and effectively has 4 pillars that it builds on. The first one is honesty in all aspects of research. The second one is rigor. So we're trying to be rigorous in all disciplinary norms and standards. We need to be transparent and open in our communication. So, for example, declaration of conflicts of interest, reporting research findings, so on and so forth. And then, of course, the care and respect that someone needs to show for the participants and the subjects of research, with respect to whether they're human or animals, and also for the stewardship of research and scholarship for future generations. So if you think about those four things in your research mentality, it's the question was that I posed in the beginning, what constitutes good research? Obviously it's rigorous, it's methodologically sound, but at the same time, it has to be honest, it has to be transparent, and it has to demonstrate care and respect for the participants. So we shouldn't be forgetting in basically trying to achieve rigorous results and sound results, the other three pillars of the research integrity framework. So keep those things in mind as you're conducting your research. And if there was a definition of what would be research misconduct, again, this framework to support research integrity summarize it in these 5 points, and one of them on its own constitutes research misconduct, but obviously a lot of the time we see a combination. So fabrication, it's something, making up results and presenting them as if they were real. There have been cases in the past where papers were retracted because they were simply reporting things that were not there. Falsification, which is not fabrication but changing the research processes or omitting data without having a good cause. So I'm not here referring, as I said, to perhaps having an outlier in your sample which doesn't fit with everything else. You can still report that, but then in your analysis you could say, actually, this has been an outlier case and we should be excluding them. Obviously, plagiarism. Plagiarism is not only other people's material, but something that, again, is really linked to the fraud triangle, and the pressures is you see a lot of academics self-plagiarizing. So you see academics producing, it's sometimes when we look at appointment panels, I used to chair appointment panels, when you look academics having a large number of papers in a very short period of time with very similar titles, you start looking into those papers in detail and you might find out that a lot of them share similar sections, which shouldn't happen. And then, of course, failure to meet ethical, legal, and professional obligations, breach of confidentiality, lack of informed consent, misrepresentation of involvement or authorship, and, of course, improper dealing with allegations of misconduct, attempts to cover up misconducts or reprisals against whistleblowers. All these things are things which constitute research misconduct. Now, the theory of research ethics, if there is such thing, is underlined by 4 principles. And those 4 principles, again, these are principles that you can take into consideration when you're thinking about designing even your research. The first principle is the non-maleficence, and this is minimizing harm. And obviously, as I said, it's not about simply humans, but it's also about other living organizations. So this is one of the key principles around animal testing and whether animal testing is ethical or not. Beneficence is the second one, which is your research needs to maximize the benefit. Autonomy, where you respect the decision-making capabilities of autonomous persons and enable individuals to make reasoned, informed choices. And I'll talk a bit about informed choices in a minute. And then also justice, which is distributing the benefits, the risks, and the costs of any research fairly across different populations. So one important bit in this whole area around research ethics is this autonomy and the consent. And it's not simply consent, but is what we call informed consent. And those, you come from psychology, you probably know the concept quite well. And the informed is around providing your interviewees or your respondents with adequate information in terms of the format of the information you will be receiving, the time it's going to take them to give you that information. It's also something which is related to a voluntary activity. So there is lack of coercion, you know, perceived or otherwise. There shouldn't be someone forcing your participants taking part in a study. So it's not, in the past we would consider, you know, I'm doing this research on an organization. I'll get the manager to basically pick up the phone and call a few employees and tell them you need to participate to this study. It doesn't have to say, you know, otherwise I'm going to do X, Y, Z, but even that phone call, it's a form of coercion. And it means that the participant is not doing it on a voluntary basis. And that can also have implications on the way your participants respond to questions. Because they have been coerced to respond to those questions, and therefore they might be seeing that research in a slightly different way, not in an objective way. And obviously, competence, you know, your participants' competence to address and understand the questions and everything like that. And the consent is a process, is not an event. And what I mean there, if you're planning on using the data you're collecting for a variety of different purposes, you need to tell your participants exactly that. If you told your participants, we will only be using the data for this purpose and this purpose only, you're not allowed to do any other study with that data in the future. So that's really, really important. And this is why occasionally the informed consent statements can have this ambiguity or this vagueness there in terms of the use of data. So you can then say to your participants, look, we will be using this data for this study, but perhaps follow-up studies as well around the same subject. And that's something really, really important to understand, that it's not something that you give now, it's a process, and participants can withdraw their consent almost at any point they wish, and you should tell them the process that they can withdraw their consent throughout that. So consent is not static, it's fluid. You need an ongoing consent, especially if the research moves towards a different direction, and you need to be able to get your participants to understand that you might be using their data in more than one ways. Now, the other bit is around harms and benefits, which I said. So it shouldn't be doing any harm. It's not just physical harm, obviously. You know, the emotional harm, the risk of upset. If you're doing sensitive interviews around sensitive subjects, the reputational damage. It also has to do with your safety, lone working, emotional distress. For example, for researchers who are doing very sensitive subjects, we need to make sure that they have mechanisms to cover their emotional distress. There was I can give you two examples of that. There was a few years back when I was the faculty associate dean for graduate studies at the University of Kent. We used to have this scheme called the Vice Chancellor Research Scholarships, and there was we were having about 30 to 35 scholarships every year for students, similar to SENS in a way, complementing the SENS scholarships. And we had a project which was really, really interesting about drug addicts and, you know, the time they spend in prison and the way, you know, the system would get them back to a normal life after their finish their conviction, everything like that. The person that was actually doing it was a former drug addict, former convicted person. And when they submitted the proposal, there were two very immediate questions raised. First of all, has this person established a mechanism to cope with the emotional distress, because they would be visiting their past, something that they had put hopefully behind them? And also, was there any danger for them as a researcher, given that they would have to visit the prison, they would have to talk to convicts, and whether there was any danger about, you know, the information they were handling and then their life outside prison. And in order to address that, we had to get the person to work with the supervisor to put a plan together for almost every eventuality. The other project was a sense project, which basically it was a colleague of mine from Kent, who was going to do a very interesting project on working conditions for the employees of Deliveroo. And obviously, you know, in these circumstances, you start talking about precarious working conditions which might not be complying with legal standards and everything like that. And the way they were going to do their research was through some form of ethnographic analysis. So they would become an employee of Deliveroo for a period of time themselves, almost like some type of mystery identity person, and they would be collecting all the data and all the information. And obviously, you know, we had concerns about their lone working and about, you know, potential danger if their identity was revealed, and how then they would collect that information from others. Was there informed consent from other employees of Deliveroo about the information they were collecting? Because, you know, they would be doing it almost like a hidden identity format. So again, we had to work with them. Eventually, the project didn't go ahead in exactly the same way because it was also impacted by COVID-19. But we had to work with them to think about, you know, the harms and benefits. So there are harm benefits not only for the participants of the research, but also for the researcher themselves. And, you know, obviously, at the moment, you're working for projects which have less of that potential, but as researchers in your life, you might then go and embark on processes which could potentially pose a lot of those questions. And the final bit is, you know, the benefits, and you need to define the benefits. Who are the benefits for? Are you trying to influence policy? Are you trying to improve people's lives? What are you trying to do with your research, and what is beneficial? The last bit there, remember the principles was this around justice, which is the distribution of benefits and burdens. And it has to do with exploitation, unfairly taking advantage of research participants. The project I've just mentioned around Deliveroo is an exact demonstration of that. And also imposing unfair burdens on participants for the sake of benefits to themselves or others, trying to think what's best for your participants. Might not necessarily be what you think is the best for them, but they also need to think that that's the best for them as well. And also unfair exclusion of particular groups from participation in research, and the benefits that may attach to participation, which is the discrimination. And that also goes down to sampling. And a lot of the time it has to do with methods of sampling, which is around conveniencing or snowballing. Conveniencing sampling and snowballing sampling can actually lead to discrimination practices, and therefore they might lead to bias in the sample, and making, you know, pose questions about the research ethics of that particular research agenda. Another area which is really important to consider, especially for those of you that you're doing things around research around sensitive areas and areas where you will be collecting participants' information, is confidentiality. And the legal framework is very clear there. What details should be kept confidential. There is also the GRPD framework, which tells you how you need to store certain type of data, how you can identify or not identify participants. In principle, personal details, health details, history, financial status, contact details, relationship, political, religious beliefs, and sexual orientation are sensitive data that has to be kept confidential if you need to collect it because I think there are two questions here. First question is, do you actually need to collect this data? What is the purpose that you're collecting the data? Obviously, for example, for a project, think manager, think male, the sexual orientation is something that you need to collect. It's important for the purpose of the project, but there might be other projects where the sexual orientation might not necessarily required. So you need to think what is required in terms of data collection, and then once you've established that it is required, how you're going to basically ensure that it's confidential. You can also, for example, a lot of the research councils at the moment, when you think about submitting research grant proposals, they ask you to provide a very detailed, what they call data management plan. And as part of the data management plan, they ask you to say, look, this is how the data will be collected, this is how the data will be stored, and this is how the data will actually be destroyed in compliance with legal requirements after it is destroyed. So most of the time you just say, it's going to be collected this way, it's going to be stored on a computer which is not necessarily always connected to the internet, so it cannot be hacked, or on a hard drive which is not connected to the internet, or on a server of a company that complies with GDPR principles, so on and so forth. So all these are things that you need to consider as you're going along your research. And of course, as I said, there are limits to confidentiality. When information is vital to work with another professional, when the individual is at risk, when there is risk to another individual, individuals who are minors, and of course, whether there are legal proceedings there, and that those are the principles of limiting confidentiality, where the data has to be shared with relevant authorities. There is this very interesting study on confidentiality and anonymity in practice. It's published in the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. The title of the paper is No Trial and No in brackets trial but tribulations when courts and ethnography conflict. The paper is on research on animal rights activists, and the person that did the research was called to court to identify the respondents in the study. And basically the researcher spent 159 days in jail because he refused to break confidentiality as part of the research. And, what would you have done in this case? You can think about it. And, what are the limits to confidentiality? So you're dealing with a case, you're doing a project, and we have projects who are funded on social work and social care. Just to give you an example, one of the schemes we run, it's a scheme around postdoctoral fellows. And 3 or 4 years ago, there was someone from Kent. She's now working, I think, in the law school, Aravinda. I don't know whether anybody you met her. And she was going to develop, as part of her project, she was going to develop this kind of mobile phone application for social workers, which was almost like a list, a tick list that they could tick a number of things, a number of statements, and the software would give them the risk of a child being abused. So, social worker walks into this apartment, imagine it like that. They have their mobile phone, and they're basically, the software was asking them to look for cues, behavior of the parents, certain things, and all these were based on previous research. And, they would tick the boxes, and the software at the end, they would give them an outcome. Obviously, they would have to use their informed judgment as well, but they could say, this kid is probably at 95% risk of being abused. And, cases like that, child abuse, terrorist acts, are there cases where pose themselves as challenging cases for limiting confidentiality? How would you report that? Who do you go to? What is part, of your research? So obviously, in the first case, you're talking about animal rights activists. The person that did the research decided to basically not breach confidentiality, and they spend a number of days in jail. What if someone else is in danger? How do you treat that? And how do you ensure that you approach the right type of authority to report whatever you need to be reporting? So there are a lot of interesting questions here that you could possibly think about. There is this other interesting study, which was research on drug users in Australia. And the title is The Consequences of Knowing Ethical and Legal Liabilities in Illicit Drug Research. The data collected, the study collected data on illegal drug use, and the project eventually got cancelled because confidentiality could not be guaranteed, because effectively once you know that someone's making illegal use of drugs and you're called by the police, you need to report that because it's part of the legal framework, and therefore it's not a research that you could easily do. And it goes back to the project that I mentioned earlier as part of Kent, with the former convict going into the prison and doing very similar type of research, maintaining anonymity, maintaining confidentiality. And occasionally there might be some projects which are not doable just because of that, just because there are so many ethical implications that it's very, very difficult to navigate through all these issues. There are some further ethical questions, and I'll conclude with that, around personal relationships and whether they're good or bad in influencing the research, confidentiality, trust, and power. So this is very usual in research being undertaken in organizations. I had a case a couple of years ago of a master's student, not a PhD student, not a doctoral research, a master's student. She was going to do, her research was on transgender individuals and promotion prospects into organizations. So for example, does it really matter whether you are a transgender individual, and effectively does it matter for your promotion within an organization? They were approaching it from the side of what the framework should look like to ensure a transparent and fair and equal promotion prospect. But there were a lot of confidentiality and a lot of issues there, because some of the participants might not necessarily wanted to reveal to their employer that they were transgender, and that would automatically create issues around the trust and the power and how the managers of that organization would be using that information. Clarifying boundaries and knowing when and where to seek help, about your own emotional distress as well, especially if you're doing research on sensitive topics, sharing supervisor responsibility, help with careers and networking. How far can we actually use our research and our connections that we build through interviews to progress our own career? Is this ethical? Obviously, there are ethical questions around choosing examiners for PhDs. And then, of course, as you exit the PhD journey, the doctoral research journey, ownership and authorship of papers, intellectual contribution, so on, so forth. So there is this very interesting framework around ethical problem solving. And here it's about the student and the supervisor. So the ethical principle, avoiding harm there, the issues that have been reported by supervisor, abuse or exploitation, dual relationship, beneficence, competence and adequacy of support, boundaries of supervisor role and support, autonomy, conflicting demands. For example, there is a demand, there is a conflict around timely completion of a PhD project versus allowing the student to develop autonomously. Abandonment, inequity, group versus individual interest. There are a lot of questions there. It's not only about, and I'm not saying that this is actually happening, but there is a lot of discussion around the relationship between the project supervisor and the supervisee of that project, and how that relationship is governed by ethical frameworks, and how that relationship is beneficial for both the researcher, not the doctoral research, but the researcher in general, and the supervisor of that research project. Now, in principle, research requires ethical approval whenever there is human participants, and I appreciate that in your case, these might have been already issues that have been raised by your supervisor, but perhaps if they haven't been raised with your supervisor, you should raise them with them. You know, you could say, look, we've done this. You could always ask them to look at the ethical approval application they have submitted to the university's good practice, to share that with you and for you to read it and think about all these issues. So human participants, it requires ethical approval. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a detailed or a lengthy ethical approval, but it has to do it has to go through some ethical approval. Human data, especially when there is access to personal, sensitive, or confidential information. Obviously, when there is things around human tissue or sample, whether there are non-human subjects, animals, so on and so forth, and research involving none of the above, but raising material ethical questions about, you know, the use of the research and the implication it might have for participants outside. I've got a few additional references if you want to do some additional reading about research ethics and research implication. For example, the Johnson et al. In 2014, making researchers moral, why trustworthiness required more than the ethics guidelines and review. It's some of them are a bit more philosophical as readings, but it's always useful to get that understanding, and it's always useful to be able to raise those questions with yourselves before you even start the research project, because the last thing you want to happen is to basically embark on a project and then suddenly realize that it has so many ethical implications that it's almost impossible to bring it to any kind of fruition. So there is some additional reading there. When I put the recordings on the VLE, I will also put the slides next to them, so you can then look at the slides only, or look at the recording and the slides, or whatever it's suitable for you. So I want to pause here and see whether there are any questions around this first bit around research ethics. Quick question, in your undergraduate studies, have you covered anywhere these aspects? Jade, I can see you nodding. You want to share where that?
Yeah, so in my second year, I had to do a module called Research and Learning from Experience, where I basically undertook my own research project for the year. So I had to do my ethics application through that, and it was a very lengthy process, but because it was kind of my first time doing it, I had a lot of help from the supervisor. So yeah, and that'll be good experience when I do my dissertation next year as well.
Sarah, I could see you nodding as well. Do you do something similar in the School of Psychology?
Yeah, just throughout the entire, both, you know, stage 1 and stage 2, and obviously into stage 3 as well. It's heavily discussed because we do a lot of research. We've already done 3 different research projects, which has included ethical procedures and having to give informed consent, get informed consent, and briefing, debriefing participants. So I think we've got quite a good foundation of knowledge about why ethics are important and in what context you need to think about it.
But I think one of the misconceptions here is that the ethical approach or the ethics is about the participants of the research only. And I hope what I managed to install in your mind is that research ethics is not only about the participants and their informed consent, it's also about you as a researcher and the way, not only the way you approach research in an ethical way, but also what are the implications for you as a researcher, especially if you're dealing with sensitive subjects, because you might have to deal with sensitive subjects in the future as potential researchers.
Yeah, that definitely came through. That was good to know. Thank you.
Right. I think that concludes the first bit. I have scheduled for a break now, so we can basically refill our cup of coffee, tea, or whatever you want. We'll come back. I'll talk a bit about just before we break. Are you using SPSS for your empirical analysis so far? What are you using in terms of quantitative? No, have you done any quantitative analysis? Any of you?
No,
Danny?
not yet. I'm doing the quantitative part of the research project for our research, but we haven't got around to collecting any data or anything like that.
Okay.
All I know is that it will be conducted through Qualtrics and then possibly exported into Excel and analyzed that way, but I'm not sure.
Okay. So I might show you a bit. Has anybody come across Qualtrics? Have you used Qualtrics?
Yeah, Pearson, I have used it.
Okay, so at least two of you have seen Qualtrics. I might just very quickly do a demonstration of Qualtrics for the sake of others, in terms of the overall understanding of what it could do or what it can't do, and then perhaps I'll talk a bit about Excel and how to utilize Excel. I think it's going to be useful for. Has anybody of you done pivot tables?
Yeah.
You have done, Danny. Okay, so pivot tables is one of the tools that you can actually use to analyze data, especially big data sets, and perhaps then also give you a short demonstration of JASP, which is one of the problems we face with quantitative and also qualitative. The qualitative data analysis can actually be done much easier with an Excel and a Word file. You could still do it. You don't necessarily need to use NVivo. Obviously, NVivo facilitates things, but it's not always necessary. The problem with the data analysis, the quantitative data analysis, is that most of the software that does solid quantitative analysis, the likes of SPSS or Stata, is usually through subscription and most of the time quite expensive. So JASP is being developed by the University of Amsterdam. So it's a very solid academically built software for data analysis. It has a lot of examples, so you can teach yourself to use it, and at the same time it's free. It's an open source platform that you can utilize. So I'll do a bit of a demonstration around those three areas and talk a bit about quantitative methods after the break. Is that okay?
Right. Yeah, thank you.
So it's 2 minutes past 11. Shall we say 11:20? Come back. Excellent.